Hello, welcome everybody, and this is our lecture on Chapter 10, Communication in Close Relationships for our interpersonal communication semester. So the first thing I want to do before I jump into lecture, there are a couple things I want to point out. Firstly, throughout this lecture, you're going to hear me make a lot of connections between Chapter 9 and Chapter 10. I think Chapter 9 and 10 pair really well with one another because 9 talks about why we get into relationships. It discusses different models and types of ways of looking and analyzing relationships. The two that we focused on were NAPS and the dialectical perspective. And now in 10, instead of just looking at different models of relationships, what we're going to do is we are going to study what actually happens in relationships as far as the communication necessary for relational closeness, relational maintenance. We're also going to talk about a wider breadth of different types of relationships. So while NAP's model, for example, in Chapter 9, really focused on a lot of romantic relationships, even though it could be applied to non-romantic relationships. Here in this chapter, you get a really nice overview of both romantic relationships, friendships, and family relationships as well. And this is the only chapter where we dive quite deep into family communication. And so let's go ahead and jump in. As always, I'm really only going to pull from the chapter what I would like you to focus on as far as our discussion forums and our journals. Everything else, of course, in the textbook is wonderful information. However, the information that are on the slides is really what I will be focusing on as far as applying in our online modules. So let's define what a close relationship is, and we can't really define closeness in relationships without really talking about intimacy. And of course, I'm sure you've all used the word intimacy before. You know what it means. Again, I would like to remind you all that with a lot of other vocabulary words that we've had in our semester so far, to not take intimacy out of the context of communication studies. So here in communication studies, intimacy is actually a measurable variable. So it can be something that you can measure, that you can track, that you can study. And there are interpersonal communication researchers who make it their life's work to study and focus on interpersonal relationships and the level of intimacy involved in them. And so let's break down intimacy first. So intimacy is relational closeness, and there are 4 dimensions that I would like you to focus on: emotional, physical, intellectual, and shared activities. So emotional intimacy is when you're able to express your feelings with someone else. They know how you feel about certain things. They know the depths of your emotions, and vice versa, you know theirs. Physical intimacy is being able to be physically intimate. This can mean sexual intercourse, but it doesn't have to mean that. It can also mean things like being comfortable with sitting close to that person, hugging that person, holding hands with that person, so on and so forth. When, of course, we get more familiar with our friends, we are much more comfortable sitting closer to them or hugging them than we would be if we were not as intimate with them. So physical intimacy encompasses a lot of wide-ranging nonverbal forms of communication. The third is intellectual sharing. This is when you have intimacy as far as your ideas, when you're able to sit down and talk to someone else about your career ideas, your political opinions, your thoughts in general about people in the world and life. You're able to engage in that intellectual sharing, and that ultimately leads to further intimacy when other people are able to, of course, identify how you think and why you think certain things. Then, of course, we have shared activities. This is when you are able to do things with other people. And one interesting thing that research has found is that shared activities tends to be a higher rated form of intimacy among men than women. Men typically express their intimacy by spending time with one another by doing an activity such as playing sports or watching football or doing something as a shared activity, which is quite interesting when you look at that data. And we'll look at that a little bit later in our chapter as well. One thing to note is that not all relationships have all 4 qualities. They don't have to have all 4 qualities. And it's also important to recognize that not all relationships that you have are intimate. At times you can have relationships, for example, with coworkers or acquaintances that are solid, continuing relationships, but that doesn't necessarily mean you are intimate with those individuals. So again, as I mentioned a little bit previously in our last slide, men and women do have different ways of categorizing, discussing, expressing intimacy. However, we find that men and women are both just as equally as concerned with developing and maintaining intimacy in their relationships. Women are more interested in the emotional intimacy. Men, as I said, are much more likely to create and express intimacy by doing things together. So this is important to recognize, because when men and women, or individuals in general, express their intimacy in different ways, that may mean that there isn't that listening fidelity, like we talked about in chapter 7, where there's a true understanding of what the other person's trying to do. And so it's important to recognize that if someone is trying to express intimacy in a particular way that maybe you are not comfortable with or that you're not used to try to be a more competent communicator and recognize that perhaps the way they're expressing their intimacy isn't the way I want to express intimacy. And by being able to recognize that leaves a little bit more room for productive conversations about your relationship. It opens up meta communication, as we talked about in chapter 9, talking about how you talk about your relationship. And it's, I think, very, very important to recognize that. In addition to gender, culture is also another factor, and how we look at intimacy. Culture definitely affects the expression of intimacy. However, we do see that these differences become less prominent as the world becomes more connected. One key researcher in our field of communication studies, Gudi Kunst, who also worked with another researcher with the last name of Kim, they both found that when people come from different cultures, one of the biggest factors in their relational closeness is developing an interpersonal relationship. And they found that interpersonal factors will always outweigh intercultural factors. And what that means is that Gudi Kunst and Kim found in their research that if we just make strong, good relationships with other people, all the different cultural factors between us and them fade away. They are less salient in our communication. So it's really awesome. What that tells us is that most of all cultural conflict can be remedied by creating really good interpersonal one-on-one relationships with other people. What we do find, though, in different expressions of intimacy are between Asian and European cultures. These cultures tend to have different ways of expressing that intimacy. We touched on this a little bit in chapter 2, where we talked about different cultural values. So individualism, collectivism, high context, low context. What we find is that European and Western cultures tend to be much more verbal with their intimacy. So they'll say things like, I love you, and they'll express intimacy very verbally. Whereas with Asian cultures, because they tend to be more high context cultures, will not verbally express themselves as much, but they will express intimacy in other ways. So for example, when I was in Japan, I was discussing the idea of intimacy and love with one of my colleagues, and they told me that it is very, very, very rare for Japanese individuals to tell one another, I love you. So for her grandparents actually had been married for almost 60 years, she said, and not once had they ever said, I love you to each other until they were literally on their deathbed, both about to pass away. One passed away before the other, but that was when they actually said it. So it's incredibly rare in her culture to do that because they believe that expressing intimacy non-verbally or in a higher context through behaviors and actions, things you do for people, is more important and more an appropriate expression of intimacy. All right. Also, one of the things I do want to discuss are that there are intersections between gender and culture as far as expression of intimacy. One example I can give you is that in India, men who are good friends actually hold hands as they're walking in public to indicate their intimacy as friends. So to us, we usually associate holding hands with romantic relationships. However, for them, it is much more appropriate for males, and so they're the gender of males, to hold hands to express their friendship. It's very interesting when you kind of look at both of those factors at the same time. So social media and intimacy, what we find is that relational intimacy at times does develop more quickly through social media and most computer-mediated communication. Computer-mediated communication is also referred to as CMC. So if you hear me say that or see that in the textbook, that's what CMC refers to, computer-mediated communication. It is a wonderful field to research and look at. And because social media is so relatively new, even though it has been obviously around for what we think is a long time, it's still a very new phenomenon, and so it hasn't been studied with certain conclusions about its impact on our relationships. We do know, of course, that social media, it can really catapult relationships to a much more quicker extent. Because when you are on social media, at times you're typically finding individuals with whom you already know or people that have shared common interest with you. So one example of this, for example, might be the video game community. If you are into playing video games and you like to play on your computer or online using a console, you'll find that people who play together and find kind of commonality in that activity of playing video games tend to develop that relational intimacy very quickly with one another. For example, one of my close friends plays World of Warcraft, and he leads a group on, I forget the technical term, forgive me for those of you who do play it, but he leads a group on World of Warcraft, and they do raids, once a week on specific days, and they finally met up face to face, and I asked him, I said, is it a little strange to have met people face to face that you've been talking to online for years, at least once a week? And he said, no, it was kind of like, it wasn't like meeting someone new. It was just like meeting up with an old friend that you haven't seen for a very long time. And he's incredibly close with these people with whom he developed a relationship via entirely just computer-mediated communication, just through this form of online socialization. Of course, on the opposite end of the spectrum, we also see the downsides of social media as well, right? So using social media or depending on it too much at times affects the way that we engage in identity management. If this sounds familiar to you, we discussed this in chapter 3. Remember that this all connects. And so because we rely now on social media to post about what we're wearing and where we're eating and what we're doing and who we're dating and all of these other forms of identity that we would normally communicate face to face and develop intimacy with people that way, social media at times can reduce the relational intimacy that we have with people that we know, especially if we're on our phones all the time, right? So now let's talk about communication in friendships. So far we've learned about what intimacy is. We talked about how it plays a big role in all relationships. We talked about the 4 different types of intimacy, and we also talked about the intersections between intimacy and gender, culture, and social media. And now we're going to look at different types of intimacy. So the first one we're going to look at is friendships. Friendships are awesome. They are what we call voluntary relationships in communication studies. And we become friends with people because they provide us social support. They're a nice network to have outside of our family, our significant other, that we can look to vent, to complain, to get support, to find joy with, to share in the hard times with. And friendships are very, very important in our everyday lives. I actually love this video from Big Bang. If any of you are big fans of Big Bang, this is when Sheldon is trying to figure out how to make a friend. And so he comes up with what he calls a friendship algorithm. And he uses that in his communication when he's trying to ask this person, who he hopes will be his friend, to go out and have a meal with him. And so let's look at the different types of friendships. I have them here, but I'm going to go actually onto the next slide so I can develop them a little bit more. So we all, I think, have a nice combination of at least one of all of these different 5 types of friendships. As you read this part of the chapter and look at this part of the lecture, I think it's awesome to self-reflect on how many of this type of friendship do I have, and is that what I really want in my life? And I think the tools that are provided in our class on on how to self-reflect is really important to applying interpersonal concepts to our everyday lives. So the first type of friendship we'll go over is short-term versus long-term friends. And so we have friendships, of course, that last very, very long. In a lot of your journals, some of you have already shared with me that you have friends that you have been friends with since high school or since kindergarten, and you've had these friends for decades and decades. Those are your long-term friends, and it is very likely that you also have short-term friends. Friends where life changes and you grow in different directions, and so they kind of fade away or they become less of a priority in your life. The second one is task-oriented versus maintenance-oriented. So task-oriented friendships are usually based around activities like work or other recreational things. So for example, you might meet a friend when you go do yoga class or study taekwondo. You might make a friend during those activities. Maintenance-oriented friends are friendships that aren't focused on sharing a task together, like doing yoga together, whereas they are more so focused on social support and just mutual liking, just really liking the other person for who they are and their personalities, shared interests in general, all of that. Low disclosure versus high disclosure. This is when you either have friends that you tell a lot about, so you disclose a lot to them. That's a high disclosure friendship. You might have a friendship that maybe you've known this person for a very long time. However, you still engage in low disclosure with them, meaning that you don't really tell them too much about your personal life or disclose any personal thoughts. We have high obligation versus low obligation friends as well. I know that this sounds sometimes incredibly crass and cold and hard to say, but we do have friends that are our ride or dies, the people that we would do anything for. And then we also have our friends, the opposite end of that spectrum, right? Friends that we have, but we won't necessarily do anything and everything for them. And so it's important to recognize that as well, because it impacts how you communicate with them. Of course, you communicate very differently with your high obligation friends and your low obligation friends. If, for example, you get into a conflict with your high obligation friend, you are probably more likely to communicate in a way where you want to patch things up and improve things, whereas with your low obligation friend, that might not be the case. Then we have infrequent versus frequent contact relationships. This is the extent to which we are likely to keep close touch with friendships. I think this is interesting too, because even especially in the age of social media, this is no longer limited to just proximity. So I could actually keep in close touch with a friend that is in New York, right, because of social media. And so this has been an interesting way to watch how different types of friendships develop in their definition over time, because before, if you had an infrequent contact friendship, typically what that meant was the person moved away or they were too far to have regular everyday communication with. And now, because of social media, you can, right? You're literally one of your friends could move to China and you could still talk to them every single day using social media, using texting, all of that. It's really cool to think about how our technology has really reduced that need for proximity. So your textbook talks about same-sex friendships, and I do get some questions on it from students, so I thought I would cover it a little bit. However, I'm not going to belabor it or beat too much out of it. I forget the term, beat the dead horse. Y'all know what I'm talking about. And because it's not really something that I will be asking you to apply or study, but I do think that same-sex friendships are quite interesting, and cross-sex friendships are even more interesting to study. And so we're going to kind of break down a couple of the key bullet points that I pulled from our textbook that I want you to focus on. Of course, the section in the textbook is a lot larger than this one, but this is really what I want you to look at. So let's look at same-sex friendships. This tends to be the first type of friendship people have, which I still think is so interesting, right? As a child, you have a 50-50 chance of becoming friends with someone who is the same gender as you or the same sex as you. And it seems that even though there's a 50-50 chance, most people still end up befriending someone with whom they share the same sex or gender presentation. What we do find, though, is that communication in friendships differs by gender. So women tend to, on average, disclose more personal information. Men, like we talked about before, really aren't interested in that verbal disclosure. They're more interested in activities and sharing in activities. Your book also talks about cross-sex friendships, also known as FWB, sometimes friends with benefits. I love the way it's written in the book. I'm sure you are all familiar with friends with benefits, this idea that you are not in a romantic relationship, however, you are friends that engage in physical, sexual activity with one another. Interestingly enough, men and women are both equally as likely to be in friends with a benefit relationship, so gender doesn't seem to be a factor there that influences that outcome. But one of the things in sum that I really want you to know is at the very bottom of this slide. What we do know is that your sex role and your gender presentation impacts communication in friendships. Sexual orientation also has a factor in shaping friendships as well. And this is because gender is such a fluid spectrum that people can present in their gender in a multitude of different ways. And how different people's gender presentations interact or don't interact will influence their communication in their friendship. And the same goes for sexual orientation as well. So let's talk a little bit about what friends do. And friends do all of these things that I put here on this slide. And these are important things, albeit, you might look at this list and be like, well, no, duh, of course friends should do that. Yes, of course they do. But I think it's really important to also look at an actual concrete list. These are things that I would hope a friendship accomplishes for me. And these are things that I hope for all of you, that you have at least one person in your life who is a good friend that would do this for you. And this actually reminds me a lot of social exchange theory. And I know in chapter 9, when we talked about social exchange theory, the conversation is heavily coached and couched in the context of romantic relationships. However, I do think that when we use this list, this becomes a great comparison level of alternatives from social exchange theory to help us decide, am I in a good friendship or am I not in a good friendship? For those of you who don't remember social exchange theory from chapter 9, this is when we discuss the idea that you look at relationships through an economic lens, through cost and rewards. One of the things you do to measure whether or not you're getting the right rewards and not too much cost is the social comparison aspect of it. And so sometimes people look at different comparison levels. This would be an alternative comparison level where you compare what you could have with what you currently have. And I think this list written down really helps us remember that we want friendships that can tackle most, if not all, of these bullet points. And if you have a friend, for example, that can only tackle half of these or maybe 3 of these bullet points, I think that this is a great tool for that self-reflection of, am I getting what I need from this friendship, or am I giving what I need to someone else, as a friend? So now let's talk about communication in the family. And families are such interesting units to study. I actually teach a course on just family communication, COMSTD 78. And we study in that class all semester different theories and models pertaining to families and the communication that occurs within them, and how it can be productive and positive or not so much productive and positive. And you'll note the definition of family differs greatly from the definition of a friendship, because while friendships are volunteer-based relationships, right? You choose to be friends with someone most of the time. You don't really get a choice with your family. And so families are defined as systems. And I love that they use this word in the definition, because I think it really helps us as communicators to understand that every single unit, every single member of that family needs one another. And so that's why they're a system. And what one does affects the rest, right? So if you got in trouble as a child at school and your parents had to, stop what they were doing at work and come get you, that's an example of how the family is a system, right? You did something, and yet your parents have to respond to it and take care of you, right? And it interrupts their day. So Families involve at least two or more interdependent people, interdependent meaning they need one another, and they have a common history and a present reality and a future with one another. And those three pieces are incredibly important to remember, because if you have a common history, then that means you have a shared narrative as a family on who you are and your family identity, and that influences how people within the family see their own roles and see themselves. They have to share a present reality, meaning that they have to feel we're in it to win it right now as a family, right? We're here to support one another no matter what happens. And then the last one is families should be able to expect to influence one another in the future. What that refers to is this idea that as families move along in their development as a whole, all families are families simply because they expect to stay together in the future. Of course, the family unit in the United States has changed rapidly from that old kind of nuclear mom, dad, 2.5 kids nuclear family model to a lot of different ways that families can be thriving and come in a lot of different shapes, sizes, and looks. And so I have an example here from Lilo and Stitch. I think Lilo and Stitch, even though it's a fictional movie, I think it's such a good tale and of how family is so important, right? And so for Stitch, for those of you who haven't seen it, he seeks a lot of self-identity, and he can't figure out who he wants to be. And he figures out that who he wants to be is tied to who he sees as his family. And that's, again, going back to that idea of that shared history, right? If you were, like Stitch, just created, right, at random, it might be hard for you to carve out some meaning to your life and identity because you don't have a shared history with another group of people. I also have here a commercial from Cheerios. This features a biracial child with a interracial couple. So the mother is Caucasian and the father is Black. And the only reason I'm showing you this is because the Cheerios brand as a marketing brand is kind of trying to reflect and respond to what today's model of a family looks like. This commercial was met with some controversy because other family members other viewers felt that it was an attack on that nuclear family because it does show a more blended family model. But I think this is just still a really good example of how not only how media tries to portray families and how that influences what we think of families, but it also how people respond to those sources of media as well. So now, how do families create family using communication? Just like we learned in chapter 9, where if you have a relationship with someone, you have to engage in that relational maintenance, right? You have to engage in communication that maintains the relationship. You have to engage in meta communication, where you talk about how you're talking about things. And families are no different. Families, however, in addition to that relational maintenance, have a lot of other factors influencing them because, like I said before, they are a system with a shared past, a common present, and a future that they predict they will share with one another. And so for that's why they have what we call family narratives. And family narratives are stories passed down from generation to generation. They are passed down to reinforce shared family goals, teach morals and values, stress family focuses, tell the family, hey, focus on this, be concerned about this should be a priority. The narrative also reflects and teaches family members how they should relate to one another as well as the rest of the world. The example I have here for you is from Little Miss Sunshine. This is one of my favorite scenes from the movie where they stop and their family is definitely not the quote-unquote typical family. And so you can see here that all the adults are talking to her in different ways, and you can really see how they've all taken on a different role of raising this young child. And this conversation all spawns from her just trying to order ice cream. And so, in addition to narratives, we also have rituals. Just as couples have rituals, we talked about that a little bit in chapter 9 with Knapp's model, where we discussed when couples integrate and bond, we see increased rituals, right? Increased rituals meaning predictable patterns of behavior. You start seeing each other at predictable times, doing things together at predictable times. Families are no different. They also have rituals. They center on celebrations at times, things like birthday parties, holidays, things like that. Family reunions. It can also be everyday life. So in your family, you might have a rule where you are required to all eat dinner together, or do something together regularly as part of your ritual. And one of the interesting things is that these rules kind of govern how the family functions. We do see that these rules kind of clash together when we get marriages between families and stepfamilies. Interestingly enough, that's why we get stepchildren who tend to not feel like they can talk up to their stepparents about everything, because that is a challenging of the role of a parent, right? So if I've always told my biological mother all my intimate secrets and feelings, right, and everything I feel on a daily basis, it's a little hard for me to do the same with my stepmother, because now I have to, in order to do that, I would have to, in my mind, see her as playing a similar role as my biological mother, which I might not be able to do, right? So that's just one example of this idea that stepchildren tend to not discuss in-depth topics with their stepparents. So remember that families are systems. So the best example I can give you is, think of like a factory, right? Everything in a factory has a job, has a role. And if one thing in that factory is interrupted, then the rest of the assembly line is also interrupted. So it's important to remember that all communication within families has multiple layers of influence, right? So if a child wants to go ask their parent to go somewhere, and we've all done this, right, where we ask mom and mom says no, so then we try to ask dad, right? Even as children, we understand this idea that our parents are interdependent, we are interdependent with them, and how we communicate within the family may be to try to play on that interdependence. Families, however, are awesome because they are also more than a sum of their parts. What that refers to is that as separate individuals, their tasks and their abilities are not as much as if all of the family members are working together as one unit. This is why families, I think, are essential to our survival as human beings. Whether you have that traditional family or you have a blended family or a non-traditional family, no matter what kind of family you have, family configuration that you have, family is essential because they are your home base, your social support that you need in order to make it through a lot of the incredibly difficult tasks that life presents to us. Families also have systems within the larger system, right? Because siblings might be their own system within their own family system. Two spouses as parents might be one system that are within the whole family system, right? And so because of that, it's important to understand the level of conversation or the level of communication that occurs in a family, as well as the level of conformity, meaning how much does that family conform as a whole system to communicating in the same way about the same things. So let me go ahead and build on that idea. So there's two major ways to help us understand conversation conformity in the family. So I kind of distilled them here because I know that in the textbook they give you a lot of information, and I feel that it can be a little overwhelming at first to try to tackle all of that. So just look at these two columns, and I think they can be a little helpful for you in determining what you absolutely need to know from this model. So what we do as researchers is we look at the level of conversation in the family and the level of conformity in the family. And then we mix them up together to try to understand what type of family communication pattern is typical or of this particular family. So let me give you an example. So first we look at the family's conversation. Are they very high or low? Do they talk a lot, freely, frequently, spontaneously? Are they very open as far as when they talk, how much they talk? Or are they a low family where they don't interact as much? Maybe when the kids come home, they all stay in their rooms and the parents do their own thing and there's not a lot of frequent conversation. So we measure that on the high and low scale. On this side, with conformity, we measure that on high and low as well. So if families are very high on the conformity level, that means that they are systems that are there to try to seek harmony, interdependence, and obedience, meaning everybody should be the same, should conform the same, behave the same way. If families are lower on that, what we get is more individualism. We get interdependence, but interdependence there is based on equality, where everybody, instead of being pushed to just be obedient, is pushed more to have equal voices within the family system. And so if we combine these two ideas of conversation and conformity, we get 4 different types of patterns. So if you are a consensual family, you have high conversation and high conformity. What that refers to is that means you are a family that talks a lot, but when you do talk, you have a lot of harmonious focus on your talk. You talk a lot, but you talk in a way to still maintain the roles, rules, regulations, and order of your family. Pluralistic families are high on the conversation, but low on conformity, meaning that they talk a lot, talk freely and frequently, and there are no rules and boundaries on their ideas, their expression of ideas, and who gets to talk to who. Protective families are low on conversation and high on conformity. So this means that these are families that don't talk a lot at all. And if they do talk, they seek high levels of conformity where there is that high harmony, obedience, keeping family structure. And then we have laissez-faire, which are low on both accounts. You have families that don't talk a lot, and when they do, there's not a lot of boundaries, rules, regulations, and how they talk. So for example, you can look at this little video that I have here from a movie clip, and you can try to guess and see what type of family communication pattern it is. I'm going to spoil it for you in 3, 2, 1. So if you don't want to know, pause this video. But the example provided to you here between this father and his daughter that are discussing things at breakfast is... Anyone know? 3, 2, 1. It is laissez-faire. So there's low conversation and low conformity. She doesn't want to talk a lot. Her answers are very short and quick. And when she does talk, she challenges him a lot. She cusses. She doesn't respect his authority as a father either. So she's much more kind of laissez-faire. All right. So now let's look at effective communication in families. How do we get to understanding effective communication? So what we just did was we identified different communication patterns. It's very important that you recognize the type of communication pattern that your family has. None of those patterns are particularly desirable or undesirable. Of course, as we said, gender and cultural factors impact the type of pattern that you have. However, once you are able to recognize the type of communication pattern that you have, you then can think, in what ways can I take what I know about how my family talks and apply that to managing the various dialectical tensions that we will experience as families. So, for example, if you know that your family is very pluralistic, let me go back to this. If you know your family is very pluralistic, where they have a lot of conversation and they're low on conformity, right? You know that starting up the conversation will be easy for you because if your family already has a pattern of talking freely and spontaneously, starting up tough conversations won't be hard for you. Does that make sense? So identifying your pattern is really helpful in understanding how you can start dealing with dialectical tensions. And just like in chapter 9, when we talked about different dialectical tensions in relationships, interpersonal relationships, we're going to talk about them here in families. And so the definitions of the dialectics are the same. I'm just going to discuss the strategies needed to negotiate them. So if you don't know the definitions of these dialectics, again, go back to chapter 9. But if families want to manage the connection autonomy dialectic, what they should do is make sure that they are flexible and provide open conversation for everybody to discuss how connected they want to be to the family and how autonomous. And of course, there should be some sort of family consensus on that level of connection, right? So there should be a family connection on, okay, maybe you want to be independent and have more autonomy. However, it's still important that you are connected to us by attending Thanksgiving every year, for example. We typically see this in families when children become adolescents, right? And we've all gone through that process where when we're teenagers, we want much more of that independence. We kind of pull away from our families a little bit more. And so there is this dialectical tension that occurs because of that, right? We also see that after children leave the nest. So we call that launching. That's why I put in quotes here. This is when couples, now that the child has left the home, they have to figure out how to be a couple again because they've lived probably a couple decades just being parents and that being the forefront primary identity. And now they kind of have to figure out how do we just be a couple again? So what you want to get in all dialectical tension discussions is a nice balance between families that are way too enmeshed or connected and close to each other, or families that are way too disengaged. You don't want a family that has too much cohesion, because then you get family members that have not enough independence, not enough not enough room to express themselves as individuals, and you have too much consensus, which means at times the quality of your family decision making might be thrown into question, because if everybody's just agreeing on the same thing all the time, are you really making the best decisions for your family? And then we also have disengaged. You don't want a family that's too separate from each other either. You don't want family members that are feeling disconnected, that don't have commitment to one another, because that will cause the family system to unravel, right? So you want to have kind of a balance between being enmeshed and disengaged. You do this by creating boundaries in the family. And boundaries are created through communication, and they can be most productively created through confirming messages. And confirming messages, as we've talked about before in our language chapter, deals with this idea where you provide support, verbal support for other people by encouraging them and saying, wow, you did this thing. I really enjoy how you did that. Or wow, I always tell my nephew, like, show me what you did at school. I love this drawing and I love what you did. And I'm really proud that you got all your vocabulary words and spelling words right this week. And I'm really proud that you made it on that your teacher's green list, right, of being a really good student for the week. And so having those verbal confirmations is important because it helps draw those boundaries for him as well. Not only does it encourage him, but it helps draw the boundary of, yes, instead of playing video games or playing too much, I should try to focus on school, because this is something that through this confirming communication, my aunt is telling me is important. I have examples here from one of my favorite movies, Our Idiot Brother, and there are 3 different clips where Paul Rudd plays the brother. He has 3 sisters. All of them have different drama in their life, and they blame him for that drama because they see him as the idiot brother, right? The dumb one that causes all the problems, when actually in reality, he's not the one. They are the makers of their own problem most of the time. And I want you to listen to in these clips how they talk to one another and how at times they're far too disconnected with one another, and they don't set healthy boundaries between their personal life, their work life, and their family life, and they don't set boundaries within their own family system as well on when to say things and when it's appropriate to talk about things. You can kind of see that in this 3rd clip over here to the right, where Paul Rudd's character kind of snaps and he gets really upset because the other sisters are kind of chewing into him when he's just trying to play charades with his nephew. And he gets really upset at that point in time. So, and he sets boundaries verbally by saying, no, like, I just want to play this game with my family. This is all I want to do. And you can kind of see that play out in this verbal communication. So lastly, let's talk about a little bit about communication in romantic relationships. We talked about this so much in 9 that I did not want to continue with this. However, one of the things that is actually in chapter 10 that I really think is really helpful is the triangular theory of love by Sternberg. And this discusses the idea that you have this triangle, and let me go ahead and zoom in on it so you can see. And Sternberg states that to have what he calls consummate love, or quality, quote unquote, what we would refer to as real love, right? You have to have 3 factors. You have to have intimacy, passion, and commitment. And you have to have all 3 of these to have consummate love. And if you only have a couple of them, then you have different types of relationships. So for example, if you just have a liking for someone, then you just have intimacy. That would mean you would share with them all your emotional intimacy. You would have maybe physical intimacy as well, but that's all you would have in the liking spectrum. If you have both intimacy and commitment, then you have a companion. If you have commitment, that means you have empty love. So without intimacy and passion, you just have empty love. If you have passion and commitment, then you have fatuous love. I know I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, but we're just going to go along with it because that's a lot of vowels at the end of a sentence. So this is when we have just passion and commitment, and so we end up kind of infatuated with another person, but that doesn't mean that we really know them. That's why there's that lack of intimacy, right? If we have just passion, then we just have infatuation without the commitment. Romantic love is when you have intimacy and passion. So you want to share that emotional intimacy, physical intimacy with other people, and you're passionate about them. But without commitment, it's not consummate love. So you also have to have commitment. And this triangle is interesting because just like the family communication patterns we just learned, this triangle really helps us identify where we are in our romantic relationships, where we want to strive to be. And if we're not where we want to be in this triangle right now, then that means we need to engage in some meta communication with our partner, right? And one of the things that the triangle definitely drives home that I put in red here that I want you to remember is that behaviors are important, but without language, the commitment isn't clear. We have to be able to verbally tell the other person and communicate intimacy, passion, and commitment. And that all has to be, you have to use language as your tool to build a relationship that way. And again, it says here, behaviors are important. And behaviors are so important. Actions speak a lot louder than words as far as the commitment factor goes. But this triangle, Sternberg's triangle, reminds us that verbal confirmation of that commitment is also important as well. So, as we're talking about that, one of the things that comes up when we talk about intimacy is this idea of affection. And the last thing I want to leave you with is this idea of love languages. And love languages refers to how we as individuals each want to express our affection for other people. And all of us have different love languages. Some of those love languages match up, right? People speak the same love language and some people don't. I have a very close girlfriend of mine, for example, who gets flowers from her boyfriend every weekend. So every weekend he either delivers flowers if he's out of town or he brings them to her when he sees her. And I've always, to me, thought like, that's wow, like I've never heard of that happening. I get flowers like every now and then from my significant other, but definitely not weekend to weekend. And so that is his love language, right? Where he expresses his intimacy through the purchasing and delivering of those flowers. However, me as a person, that's not something that would appeal to me as far as a love language. I think it's great. Don't get me wrong. However, for me, my preference in love language is quality time. So I appreciate time spent with me more than presents or gifts, and that's really how I communicate my love language. And remember what your love language is in relationship with other people that you are in a relationship with, because if love languages clash, that's where we get that interpersonal conflict, and that's where we get maybe a misunderstanding of the level of commitment. So for example, if you are someone that really likes to do acts of service, right? You want to do things for someone else. You want to do their laundry, or you want to cook them dinner, or you want to act in a way to show them that you care about them or love them with your actions. But let's say that their love language is words of affirmation, where they would rather you say really nice things to them, and give them confirming messages and verbally tell them how much you care about them. Then you two might clash in your love language, because you might be like, hey, like, I'm trying really hard, to give you acts of service and tell you that, oh, I love you by washing dishes, doing laundry, cooking dinner for you, all of that kind of stuff. And you don't really seem to appreciate it. And on the other end of the spectrum, they might think, I don't know if this person cares about me, because I really would hope that they give me words of affirmation, and they don't. And so if love languages are different, then we kind of see conflict between couples. And that really actually arises as well in the negotiating of dialectical tensions, as we talked about in chapter 9. And this again is where another concept from chapter 9, meta communication, really comes into play and is really important. If we are able to talk about how we are communicating our love, if we're able to talk about our love languages, then we're able to clarify what we're trying to express, even if our love languages are different. So with that being said, that is chapter 10. To quickly recap, what you should have learned in chapter 10 is a definition of intimacy. You should have learned about the different types of intimacy, and both the cultural, gender, and social media influences on expression of intimacy. Remember that all human beings strive for intimacy. We just express and interpret it in different ways. Then we also learned about different types of relationships. We talked about friendships. We talked about different kinds of friendships. We then talked about families and different family communication patterns and the unique challenges facing families, because they are systems that have a shared history, a present past, and a future that they hope to all share. And then lastly, we talked a little bit more about romantic relationships, building on our conversation from chapter 9, where we talked about Steinbeck's triangle. And we also most recently talked about love languages and expression of intimacy in romantic relationships. So I hope this lecture video was helpful for you. Again, always, if you have any questions, that's what I'm here for. I'm just a hop, skipping away on Canvas. Have a great rest of your week, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.